Throughout our nation's history, there have been several groups of people who have been disenfranchised from basic unalienable rights guaranteed each of us in our Declaration of Independence. African Americans were enslaved for centuries, denied freedom, dignity, and basic human rights. American women were second-class citizens, denied the fundamental right to vote until the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. These groups, among others, have fought for decades to realize their inherent rights and thus lessen their disenfranchisement in our society. In American history, there is another innocent group that suffered from this unjust disenfranchised status. Sadly, these were our children. During our Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, countless hundreds of thousands of children, aged 5 years and up, were denied an education and forced to labor long hours under inhumane working conditions to help supplement their families' incomes to merely exist. Already rich tycoons, industrial magnates, and conglomerates vastly expanded their holdings and multiplied their extreme wealth, profiting by breaking the backs and spirits of these families and generations of American children. These children were economically enslaved, denied the basic rights to freedom, safety, and education, and any say in their existence. Abuse would be a mild term to refer to their treatment. This dismal part of our history and the disenfranchisement of this group of children have been addressed in subsequent decades with the passage of laws designed to protect and closely monitor children's rights in the workplace. Indeed, many lessons can be learned from this sad time in our past. The most paramount is that wealth, character, and future of any nation lies in the manner in which their children are treated. In the decades following the American Civil War, an era of industrial growth prevailed, creating a new, extremely wealthy upper class in our society. Names like Vanderbilt, Morgan, and Rockefeller dominated our country's financial markets. Theretofore, average people had never amassed such unimaginable riches, monopolizing our country's vast industries. They felt no guilt in throwing lavish parties and excessively spending immense amounts of money on frivolous endeavors while their workers suffered. In fact, referring to this period of our history, Mark Twain coined the phrase, "the Gilded Age," in his 1873 book of the same title. Twain stated that the term carried the meaning of pretty on the outside but ugly from within. One product of the newly established elite social sector was a more affluent middle class. This in-between class became known as the white-collar families. These people worked, their children were educated, and they lived comfortably. Another, even larger class was simultaneously growing at larger numbers. This class was referred to as blue-collar. These were the working class of families whose mere existence required an immense struggle by each member to simply exist. Blue-collar families were basically comprised of agricultural laborers and immigrants who moved into the city centers in hopes of finding work in their version of the American dream. A dream was not what these people encountered. They moreover found themselves living in an ongoing nightmare. They lived in overcrowded urban slums, plagued with diseases and minimal infrastructures. The children of these families toiled 10 to 14 hours a day under hazardous and filthy working conditions. To more completely understand the disenfranchisement these generations of children must have experienced, it is necessary to examine their lives and daily routines. Childhood is supposed to be a somewhat carefree time in each of our lives, a time when young people are nurtured, loved, and protected from the harsh realities of the cold and sometimes heartless real world. It is a time to be filled with imagination and play, when children are to learn values, develop, and be educated into young adults, productive members of society, prepared to take on their lifetime's responsibilities. It is a time when each of us molds into the people we are. The child laborers of our Industrial Revolution were devastatingly robbed these basic and simple rights of pleasures of growing up. From the late 1860s through the beginning of the 20th century, the majority of urban children of blue-collar families would begin their work at 5 in the morning, reporting to work at a factory, mill, or mine to begin a 12 to 16-hour workday. They would work 6 days a week and were lucky to be allotted minimal brief breaks throughout the day. Most would work for less than 5 cents per day. It would be generous to describe the working environment of these children as cruel and unusual. They were regarded as being expendable, and their safety was generally neglected. Foremen exploited the small size of children by forcing them to work on, in, around, under, or alongside of large, heavy, dirty, and dangerous machinery. Dust, exhausts, and other toxins were rampant in these workplaces. It was commonplace for these children to be given the most hazardous tasks. Safety guidelines, emergency first aid provisions, and protective wear were practically non-existent. Most of these children would return to an overcrowded slum apartment after 10 o'clock at night, only to return to the same dismal routine at 5 o'clock the following morning. Sickness and disease were also prevalent in these environments, and one can be sure there were no sick days, and only primitive medical attention was available to those so unfortunate to fall ill. Though there are records of state passing child labor laws prohibiting the employment of young children in the industry that date back to the 1830s, the vast majority of these laws were ignored. In 1836, Massachusetts passed the first American law prohibiting child labor in that state. The hope was to promote and emphasize education over working. 16 years later, the same state passed a compulsory schooling law. These laws were never enforced nor taken seriously. Children continued to work in industrial workplaces, never having to show proof of age when applying for employment. The National Child Labor Committee, NCLC, was founded in 1904 as a private, non-profit organization and was incorporated by an act of Congress in 1907. This committee was founded by children's rights activists with the mission of promoting rights, awareness, well-being, and education of children and youth as they relate to work and working. The NCLC initiated the Keating-Owen Bill as a special project, and it became an act in 1916. Over 100 years after its founding, the NCLC continues to be a leading American force advocating the prevention of the exploitation of children and the youth in the labor market. Those issues its founders fought to correct at the beginning of the last century are still relevant and necessary today. There have been many notable child labor rights activists dating well back over 100 years. There are 3 dedicated Americans who were integral in pioneering the rights of children in the workplace who merit special mention. In 1908, the NCLC hired a young teacher named Lewis Hine to work as a full-time investigator for the committee. Hine filed many reports on the inhumanity of childhood labor during the Industrial Revolution. More important, Hine was a photographer, and he took thousands of pictures of the horrible working conditions these children were forced to endure, along with countless pictures of the vacant, soulless faces of these youths. It is universally agreed that Lewis Hine's photos put a face on this disenfranchised, innocent sector of our society, thus bringing these images to both the American public and elected officials, and making it a political issue that required addressing. In 1917, Grace Abbott was a progressive-era reformer from Nebraska who joined the Department of Labor and was assigned to the Children's Bureau, a division of department responsible for investigating and reporting issues pertaining to child welfare. In her position, Abbott worked closely with the NCLC and was active in implementing the first federal law regulating labor for children less than 16 years of age. This legislation was struck down in 1918 by the Supreme Court, Hammer v. Dagenhart. The court's decision was based on the belief that such legislation violated individual states' rights. Abbott went on to become the head of the Children's Bureau of the Department of Labor, where she spearheaded the campaign for a constitutional amendment that would limit child labor. This amendment was never ratified, but it did set a precedent that later resulted in legislation regulating the labor of children under 16 years old under the New Deal. Though not confirmed, Abbott became the first woman to be nominated to a cabinet position during FDR's first administration. In 1931, Jane Addams became the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Addams was born in Nebraska in 1860. She was reared in a society where women were expected to be content to simply marry and have children. Addams was not destined to settle for such an existence. During a trip to England, Jane came across Toynbee Hall, the first children's settlement house. She returned to the United States inspired by what she had seen abroad and went on to found Hull House in Chicago in 1889. Hull House was a settlement home for arriving immigrant families and American families in need. It was dedicated to the concerns of mothers and the needs of children. Addams was held in the same esteem as other progressive reformers like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and was instrumental in bringing national attention to the plight of children's rights pertaining to labor. Now let's look at early legislation pertaining to the rights of children and child labor laws. During this era, the most significant legislation was the Keating-Owen Act of 1916. This act was also known as the Wicks Bill, and it was a statute aimed at addressing the injustices of child labor in industry. The Keating-Owen Act sought to prohibit the sale in interstate of products produced by factories which employed children under the age of 14, mines employing children under the age of 16, and any such business employing children under 16 who worked at night or more than 8 hours a day. President Wilson originally opposed Keating-Owen, stating that he believed it was unconstitutional. The House passed Keating-Owen on February 16, 1916, and in July of that year, it went to the Senate. Democratic senators lobbied Wilson to back Keating-Owen to reinforce his reformist image. Facing re-election, Wilson gave in to this pressure and went on to sign the Keating-Owen Act into law on September 1, 1916. 2 years after its passage, the constitutionality of the Keating-Owen Act was being tried in the U.S. Supreme Court in the case Hammer v. Dagenhart, 247 U.S. 251. Roland Dagenhart worked in a North Carolina cotton mill alongside his 2 sons. The product they produced became subject to the prohibition outlined in the Keating-Owen Act, so Dagenhart challenged the act, and a North Carolina U.S. District Court ruled Keating-Owen to be unconstitutional. United States Attorney W.C. Hammer appealed the decision to the Supreme Court. The High Court ruled that the Keating-Owen Act was unconstitutional, citing that Congress had violated the Commerce Clause, the Fifth Amendment, and the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. In support of the court's decision, Justice Day stated that the act violated the purity of state rights. It would take 20 more years until the 3 branches of our government began adequately addressing the disenfranchisement of children in our workforce. The Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, of 1938, a part of Roosevelt's New Deal, unanimously swept through Congress and was signed into law in June of 1938. The act provided for a ceiling on over-hours and floor wages. It also established an eventual 40-hour maximum work week, along with mandating a 40-cent per hour minimum wage by 1945. Most importantly, it prohibited almost all child labor in the United States, with some exclusions in the agricultural industry. Upon signing the FLSA into law, President Roosevelt stated, "This is the most far-reaching, far-sighted program for the benefit of workers in this or any other country." Though the FLSA was altered and amended on several occasions, it gained the unanimous support of the Supreme Court, which upheld its constitutionality in their 1946 decision in the case of Anderson v. Mount Clemens Pottery. We have briefly reviewed the American Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age, and have taken a look at the hideous existence of the disenfranchised child laborers of that period in our history. We have discussed the groups and pioneering advocates for child labor laws in our country, and we have examined both failed and successful legislation regarding these laws, and the place each branch of our government played in those decisions. In the years since 1938 and the passage of the Fair Standards Act, there have been many laws that have been passed to control and monitor the exploitation of children in the American workplace. The issues surrounding child labor are timeless, just as are children. In fact, in today's world, there are laws being debated and embargoes placed on foreign nations where children today toil under similar working conditions as American children did during our Industrial Revolution. Former South African President Nelson Mandela once said, "There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way it treats its children." Indeed, many lessons can be learned from this sad time in our past. Most paramount is that the wealth, character, and future of any nation lies in the manner in which their children are treated.